everybody. Welcome to the Pacific Northwest Lunch and Learn. Today, our topic is navigating peace in a violent world. We have a special guest today with us, Tremayne Edwards, who is representing the Alliance for Gun Responsibility right here in Seattle, Washington. Just to let you all know that we do have questions that were submitted by our participants today, and so we have picked out some questions that probably will get us all the way towards the end of our hour, but we have allowed just a small bit of time for us to for you all to ask additional questions as we go through our day, our hour. Sorry about that. And so let me introduce our speaker. Our speaker, Tremayne, joins us from joined the Alliance for Gun Responsibilities in 2021 as the Education and Engagement Director. In this role, he provides programming that educates, engages, and advocates for communities impacted by gun violence. Before the Alliance, Tremayne worked in Virginia as the Director of Community Engagement, working to address and dismantle barriers that prevent access to various members of his community. When you cannot find Tremayne at a community event, you would find him in the mountains with his puppy. And every once in a while, you all, as Tremayne talks, you'll see his puppy run across, so you'll see him soon. Tremayne, we are so happy that that you are available to join us today on this topic. I don't know about everybody else. This topic brings a certain level of anxiety for me and the people that are in my community, my church community, my neighborhood, the people that I work with. That's always a concern. I know last night I was at a concert, and I've gone to concerts for years, and it was probably a couple of thousand people in this venue. And as I was enjoying and having a great time, I thought that if somebody wanted to take out a whole bunch of people at one time, this would be the place. And I don't think I've ever thought about something like that before, but that did come to my mind very briefly. And then I just, and my thought was, at the same time I said, well, what it is what it is. This is where I'm at this moment. And I have no control over what happens in any space that I walk into. And so I could hope for the best. And, but I am almost positive that many others share these same thoughts as they walk into different places based on what we've seen on the news. So we're thankful for you today, and we're looking forward to hearing more from you about gun laws and safety and how do we, how do we protect ourselves the best way we can. So you can have the floor right now.
Appreciate it. Apologies now if my dog decides to be the only child that he is, but he is raised by an only child, so he may start to do some things in the background. But as stated, I'm Tremayne Edwards, through and through a proud Southern boy, born in the Commonwealth of Virginia, but I've been over here as a Washingtonian now almost a year. I will have officially been here a year in August. But this is home now, as I like to joke. All the taxes get paid here now, so this is home. But I come to this space professionally with the Alliance for Gun Responsibility, as stated, and quickly to kind of gloss over who we are and what we do for those who are unfamiliar. The Alliance for Gun Responsibility works every day to creatively and collaboratively work at addressing the gun violence crisis that is happening in our communities and in our state. And we do this by promoting a culture of gun ownership that balances rights with responsibilities. And so through collaboration with experts, civic leaders, citizens, I often like to say my mantra for all things community engagement is all the people in all the places. So there are people who want to jump into this space with us and have those conversations with us as a community. We look to doing that in ways that we can create innovative policy advocate for changes in laws, promote community education, right? Really many different approaches to addressing what happens in our communities, because it takes multiple approaches to do this work with our community to keep one another safe. But underneath us, we have three legs. We have our C3, your traditional nonprofit world. Arguably 80% of my world is through the nonprofit world. That is my specialty and where I love to stay, which allows me to stay out of the world of politics and political issues, as something like this does unfortunately become very political. I live in a very public educational space where I am just here to talk to people about, what is happening, but what we can also do. I say often we've got problems happening in our communities, but that also doesn't mean that we're void of possibilities. And we've shown time and time again what we can do together as a community. So that C3 space is a lot of public education that happens for me. This next upcoming couple of months soon, I'll be at a couple of conferences. You do convenings. I joke, whether it's a book club or a national conference, if people want me there, I'm happy to be there and have this conversation, because this all starts with conversations. We do a lot of grassroots mobilization when people, ask what they can do, right? That involves community education, which means a conversation. All of this starts with a conversation of how we can all come together and address what is happening, not only in our communities in our state, but across the country. I think we all are very aware of what's happening in our country right now with many issues, but one of which that has been increased crime. And it's going to take all of us, addressing that together as a community, because at the end of the day, regardless of what, sides people may be on or where they're thinking through on this issue of gun violence, right? We all can agree that we need to prevent gun violence and that we all deserve to feel safe. Our children deserve to feel safe, which, at this point now, firearms deaths are the leading cause of death for American youth. And we can all agree that our children don't need to be exposed to those traumatic experiences when they just deserve to be going to school, to be having fun, frolicking through their neighborhood as a country boy, jumping off of barnyards, don't tell my mama, but having those experiences and not those that are traumatic. So we have that C3, we have our C4 with a lot of grassroots advocacy space. And then we have our PAC, which endorses candidates who believe in gun responsibility, who want to see those changes, common sense changes that will allow safety for everyone. And again, right, we are an organization that promotes those rights with responsibilities. So we promote a culture of gun ownership that balances rights with responsibilities and making sure that we have everybody at the table that we can do those things together safely and effectively for all. Outside of that professional space, I come to this personally as well. At 5 years old was the first time I ever encountered a gun. My father was not a responsible firearm owner, and so the guns were not safely stored away at home. And so at 5 years old, I'm a 5-year-old. I remember it very much to this day because every time I tell the story, I get goosebumps. But he was in the kitchen with a friend, and I was not minding my business in their bathroom, as I would always do. And I found a firearm in the bathroom that wasn't safely secured anywhere. And at 5 years old, it was the first time I ever held a handgun. I remember picking it up. I remember it being heavy. Thankfully, to this day, right, I did not pull the trigger to figure out just exactly if it was loaded or not. But there are many children across this country that don't get that far in their stories with unintentional shootings because of that curiosity of a child, right? So that's the first time I ever held a firearm, was at 5 years old because it was not safely secured away. And then a couple of years later in elementary school, there was an altercation that happened outside of my aunt's home with two relatives, and one of them got a firearm and shot at our other relative, who thankfully lived through it. But I remember them coming into the house, having that gunshot wound, having that blood, and what a traumatic experience that was for my cousin at elementary school to have to navigate what just happened outside of the household and how it's brought into the household and what we were now being exposed to and seeing, and having our family try to navigate explaining that to us. And then not last year, late 2020, my cousin lost her partner to someone who had an altercation with him and stole a firearm from somewhere else and brought it into the household and killed my cousin's partner. And so now she is a single mother of their young teen son. And we can all agree that parents deserve to have both of their parents, and boys especially deserve to have their fathers. Navigating quite an odd time to be a teenager, but thankfully they are both in therapy and going through that. So personally, I come to this space too, because I've lived or been impacted by it in a few different ways. And I have three beautiful young nephews who, not only my nephews, but right, many others' nephews and children and people in the community. I don't want kids to keep having these stories. I don't want people to hold on to these stories and have that, what that means to them and how that has impacted them. And I also lost my best, at the time was my best friend in high school, who committed suicide a day before our graduation in high school, and shot himself with a firearm, and he was supposed to sit beside me at graduation. So I've lost people to this unfortunate crisis that we're in, and dare I say could have possibly lost mine at a young age. And thankfully, very thankful that that did not happen. But there are many out there that don't get that same story. And my passion to this every day is kind of taking that pain into purpose and really just having conversations with people around the work that we can all do to address what's happening in our communities and how we can make safer communities to the best of our ability together. So I'm happy to be here, but that's kind of my personal and professional tie into this space.
Great. Thank you, Tremayne. I really appreciate hearing your story. So let's get right into our questions. The first question is, and these questions are from our audience, our participants. Where can we find common ground for greater safety without getting into the Second Amendment debates?
You would think after 2 years being in a pandemic, I would stop muting myself. Arguably usually one of the first questions we often get, right? So we, especially in my space, right? I, in the C3 space, do not live in anything political. I come at this very much as a human, appealing to other humans, wanting to keep each other safe. And so that's usually the best start that we tell people that, this is a hard conversation to have, right? Even every time I share my own life experiences, it doesn't get easier sharing those experiences because it reminds me of the hurt and the pain, but like I realize that it's important. But right, that also levels the conversation a little bit of where I'm coming from in this and just really genuinely wanting to help others and save others. Right, but there's also words that we don't use as an organization because that's not the space that we're trying to live in. You will never hear our organization talk about gun control. We always talk about gun violence prevention because that is what we are, right? It's very beautifully marked on my shirt today, which I promise was not on purpose. Coincidence, I just moved, and so I have nothing yet in terms of clothes that are in boxes, right? But we talk about gun violence and what that means in our communities. So we talk about gun violence prevention. We're never going to talk about gun control, right? We also approach this at many different areas, right? We've had people also on our staff who are pro Second Amendment, right? Who have been Marines and who are firearm owners. We want responsible gun owners on our team because the majority of Americans, majority of responsible firearm owners believe in many of the common sense things that we do too, right? In terms of safe storage, especially right with their children. Many people want the same things, kind of those baselines. And so really when you're having these conversations, it's important to remember the words that are kind of going to be, for the lack of words, right? The trigger words, right? If you immediately come into a conversation and you immediately talk about gun control, you're going to lose the audience, right? Because that's going to be an issue in terms of a trigger word, right? We talk about this as gun violence. So being able to talk about that, right? We also talk about this as an issue of safety, right? And everybody, again, regardless of whatever side you may live on, can agree to safety. Everybody wants to feel safe. Now, right? We might all go about that in different ways of how we procure that safety for us in our household or what we view it in our communities, but everybody can agree to safety. And so also having these conversations around what that safety can look like are two really important factors when we have this conversation as well. But also, right, bringing everybody at the table, I mentioned, right, when we make policy, whatever, we try to really bring everybody to this table who wants to join us to make sure who here has an additional lens from their various communities that when we try to pass good life-saving legislation, it doesn't impact one community over the other. So it's really important to, when you have those conversations, be wary of what words you say and what words you don't say. Because arguably when you go in immediately talking about gun control, you're going to lose a group of people. But if you come in saying, hey, we have a gun violence crisis, we have a gun violence issue happening in our communities, everybody's going to agree to that, right? At the end of the day, we do have an issue that is happening around gun violence in our communities. Now, how you go from that conversation as well is, we need to prevent that, right? And that prevention looks many different ways. That isn't just us always going to a law and saying we need X, Y, and Z to, to ban this or to control that, right? But that also means, right, if it's the sake of our children in our communities, more community centers. We need access to direct service providers who are out there who are doing this work, right? We are not a direct service provider. We will never be a direct service provider, but we advocate for direct service providers. We have a beautiful organization that we've just become partnered with this past year. And she works with mothers, right, who've lost their partners or their children who've lost those fathers, and working especially with those mothers, right? Because in order for those mothers to just still show up for themselves and for their children, right, somebody has to show up for that mother to make sure that she is also supported to continue running that household and living life. So we advocate for better funding for these smaller CBOs, which stands for community-based organizations. So there's many ways that we can navigate that conversation that everybody can agree on too, right? We also talk about, when we talk about this space, right, if it's also somebody who may be pro-Second Amendment, which is totally fine, right? We also have a suicide issue, right? We talk often in our country around gun violence, right? But we always go straight to mass shootings. And we most certainly will never minimize mass shootings because that is an issue that still obviously needs to be discussed, but it actually doesn't make up the bulk of the deaths that happen in this country. And especially when we look at this state alone, right? 70% of the deaths are by suicide gun deaths, right? We have a mental health, we have a public health issue. So that's also right in the messaging when we talk about this and we want to talk to people, right, if you will, across the aisle. We talk about this as also a public health crisis because people who are struggling with mental illness at home and don't have, right, again, if we talk about direct services, they don't have the resources available for them to navigate this. So they're doing it alone, which can create harm for themselves or others now in that household, right? We really also tackle this as a public health crisis. So when we talk about gun violence in our communities, when we talk about gun violence prevention in our communities, we also tackle this on the messaging point of it's a public health crisis, right? Because when that life is lost, that whether that's my, my cousin who's now lost her partner, that's an issue now for mental health of what her and her child have to navigate, right? When you talk about the lives lost, it can also be an economic crisis. When you talk about the money that is now on the taxpayers who sometimes have to foot the bill of what happens there, there's many ways to navigate this conversation that never, ever has to go into that yucky, as I would call it, the yucky political world. I'll let somebody handle that at Federal Hill. I come at this with the messaging of it's a public health crisis, we have a gun violence issue, and that's how I would say that kind of always levels it out of a conversation that if you start there, it kind of can lay the playing field that people aren't think you're coming in political with an agenda.
Mm. Oh, thank you so much. That was really interesting. All the different ways that we can talk about gun prevention and the ways that it crosses over to so many different areas of the lives of the people that are in our communities. And so as for us churches, for the leaders and the clergy that are on this conversation, that's taking part of this conversation, how do we start having these conversations with the people that are within our church communities?
Yeah, so I would say very similar to how, in this moment we've started, right? You put out that issue to everyone and making aware that we want to have this conversation so that people already know what's happening. But I think adding on to that previous part of the things that you can say is a great starter for where to start. We've also, and we'll get there at some point too, right? We've got organizations like ourselves who have all the resources available for folks if they want to have that conversation. But I think starting that out right now where we are in this country is everybody knows we're at this very odd, unfortunate space where it unfortunately is not hard to talk about right now because everybody is aware of it. I am currently deactivated from all things social media, so I don't know what's happening on that side of the world right now, and I'm happy to live out of it. But I can imagine it's crazy, right? But everybody, whether it's social media, whether it's through the news, however they get their information, you are seeing it at least once a day right now. And I think it's better to, be proactive than sometimes responsive to it. And so maybe getting out in front of it and saying, hey, listen, we're noticing that it's something that's happening in our communities. And we want to just do a check-in with our community here. How are you feeling? What are you thinking? and then providing those resources for folks of, but you don't have to feel this way and you don't have to see it this way. Here are things that we can all do to address it, right? Because that also builds up grassroots mobilization, right? Grassroots starts with conversations. It starts with relationships, right? And me having this conversation with, I think it's 12 or 13 of us here, right? Can take this information, can take this conversation and share it to 2 or 3 more people, right? And it grows and it grows and it grows. And that's an important piece of this, is just community education. And I think if you add on to what I just stated of ways in which there is messaging around it, I think that's a great way to just start, even if it's simply just going through the statistics of it all. But I think we're at a space in our country right now where everybody knows about it. Everybody's seeing it at least once a day right now in the media. And if anything, it is time to just start and talk about it, and really can start with that. Really just a pulse check of how are people feeling around it. I think that's also an important piece to talk about it, because people feel gun violence affect them in different ways. And it's scary, right? Whether you're a person of color, whether you're someone who's working in a school or a hospital, whether you're somebody who has children, I think it's a great time to start that conversation and just get a pulse check, if you will, on where people are feeling from their various communities that they may live in.
Thank you so much. Do you think stricter gun laws will impact the current gun violence we're seeing now?
Often questions we also get. It's a piece of the puzzle, right? If I love an analogy, so stick with me. I'm an English major by heart and a theater student. If I build the picture out, sometimes people also, right, if you talk about it the same way we do maybe even with cars, right? There's many different approaches that we do every day to keep ourselves safe in the vehicle and those outside of the vehicle, right? But you've got speed limits, and you've got your lanes, and you've got your seat belts, and you've got driver's courses for kids, right? 16, 15, 16, how to take the courses to become responsible drivers, right? Does it solve everything? No, but it has, every year we've seen less and less deaths. So, right, it's one of the pieces, right? But through all those pieces, right, every year it helps make it safer for others. So while responsible, I'm always careful with my words too, responsible life-saving legislation, when applicable, when it is needed, right, is a piece of the puzzle. Will it solve everything? No, right? Because we've also seen in our country that laws don't solve everything, right? There are people who are going to follow, and there are people that are not, right? But that also, to me, I'm somebody who is very empathetic and sympathetic in that space too, where I like to know people's stories, right? So somebody who meant to create harm, who broke the law, right? There usually was something that happened in their life a little bit deeper there, and I want to figure that out, right? And arguably that person might have been affected by X, Y, and Z, right? But if they had the proper resources of a community-based organization or direct service provider, right? Maybe somebody could have intervened in their life, right? Which goes to that tag of, yes, laws are helpful, right? But so are direct services providers, and so is public education. So laws aren't the one-stop shop way to doing it, because, right, Washington is a leader in gun violence prevention and in those laws, right? But we can only do so much in our state, right? If there's not a federal action, right? Somebody can go to Idaho, somebody can go to Indiana, whatever state, right? And cross state lines and do X, Y, and Z and still come back into the state, right? So laws can only do but so much in their own jurisdictions. And so that's why it's important to, right, also advocate for funding for direct services providers and public education. So it's a piece of the puzzle, but it's not the end all be all. It's gonna, right, it takes more approaches to solving this, solving the crisis of gun violence.
How do we deal with the NRA and gun lobbying? How can we impact that in a way that we're in the efforts of gun violence prevention?
I would say, I guess the quick and easy of it all, right, would be, it all boils down to voting, right? Your vote is your voice, right? And right, whether it's the NRA or your gun lobby or any, group out there of influence that is, doing that work on a legislator, right? They impact the legislators, right? But we are also the people who always hold more power in our vote. And if you don't like what is happening, you always have that power to, right, vote them out. We have seen with the impact of the work that we do in this state, right? The NRA and the gun lobby most certainly is still here, and the work that they do around their influence, right? But it's less and lesser each year here because the majority of citizens in this state believe in gun responsibility and right promotion of rights with responsibilities. But I would say, right, one is always going to be voting for candidates who believe in what you believe in. And then outside of that, it's really kind of getting involved in the process, right? Outside of voting is just one piece of the puzzle, but right, getting involved in the legislative process, right? People can show up in midterms and vote, but you also have your legislative hearings, and that's a great space to connect with your legislators and talk to them more because they need to hear from you more. They need to see you more. They need to see the people more than they see the lobbyists who are out there trying to influence them, right? Because to be cliched, right, we the people, right? We are the ones who should be making them make those decisions. So that would be kind of my quick and easy of it all, is ultimately being involved in the process every step of the way, and not stopping in just one space, right? When the elections are done, that doesn't stop your process of being involved with your legislators. Keep talking to them, keep emailing them, because if not, right, somebody else in opposition is also going to be emailing them the entire time.
So does the Alliance have like a pamphlet of politicians that are for gun violence prevention? And do you all have like the how-tos to navigate like this whole legislative process? Like how, I mean, like I wouldn't know how to do anything about that. So could you explain a little bit about that for us?
Yeah, so we definitely have pamphlets, bookmarks, all the things that kind of talk about statistics that are happening in our state and in our country, but also pamphlets that kind of talk extensively into the work that we do and how people can get involved. And i.e. of that work getting involved, if it's legislative hearing, you know, we go to Olympia each year. I've been with him for about a year now. So I came in COVID. So all things have been very virtual. But prior to that, we used to, you know, people who wanted to be involved in the process and wanted to speak with their legislators, who wanted to show up at legislative hearing, we would help bus them to Olympia and kind of have those lobby days with your constituents. But we most certainly always kind of would give people packets ahead of that and kind of talk them through what this process is going to look like. This is what a short session means. This is what's going to happen on this date. This is who we're going to meet with. Here are talking points. We always do our best for people who want to get involved in this process to best educate them through that process so that when they get there, whether it's been virtual right now or whether it's been in person, they know exactly what they're doing. And then we kind of give them templates and whatnot, but then we always let them go from there to like, here's the education, here's what you need to know of doing it. We're always here to assist you if you need be, but then letting people kind of personalize all their things when they meet their, you know, legislators or get to testify and hear before them. But anytime anybody works with us and wants to get involved in that process, we always happily educate them and help them navigate that process so that they feel comfortable going before their legislators and going before a panel of congressmen and women and testifying.
Thank you. Thank you for all that you shared. We spend a lot of time talking about, you know, the gun laws and convention and all the things that we can say. But I think the really crux of everything is that we want to feel safe. You know, we want to feel safe in our neighborhoods, going to church, you know, wherever space that we're in, we want to feel safe. How can we as clergy and church leaders provide confidence to our communities about, you know, that they're safe?
You know, that is probably the best question I have heard, because it's one that even now I am still thinking through, because, you know, while we promote safety, it's hard to 100% get that right if not everybody is also galvanized behind it with us. Right? It'd be a little bit easier if everybody 100% supported all these things. Would be easy to kind of give that confidence. Right? I would say in that confidence, while things are still very concerning and sometimes scary, what's happening in our communities and in our country. I often do like to tell people though, right, you know, Washington State is still a leader in this space when it comes to gun violence prevention and keeping people safe. So while things are most certainly uncertain, to be very redundant, my English professor would get me for that, right? But the state of Washington, one of the things that I just learned this past week or so of some of our research team, as we look through some of our statistics and numbers, right? I think a year or two ago, 74% of gun deaths were by suicide in the state of Washington. This past year, I think it's dropped 4%, right? So even though there are moments where things might seem uncertain or things are seeming scary, right? We are still seeing that needle change over here in our state. So there is that piece that we can tell people, you know, right? It's incremental. Change is always going to be incremental, and it may not happen overnight, right? And dare I say, being the Southern Baptist child that I am, if I hear my pastor right saying, right, but joy comes in the morning, right? There is that needle that is changing, right? We can see light at the end of the tunnel, but it takes us all working together to ensure that safety. So, you know, even though things are uncertain, right, we can still give that confidence that Washington is a leader in this fight. And there are other states that are looking to us, to the work that we are doing and wanting to replicate it. There are people from the federal level who have come over to talk about the work that we do in the state of Washington. So we're leading in that. So we can give confidence that we are leading the fight for safety, and people know that they have advocates fighting for their safety. And, you know, if people are, you know, ever concerned, I think my secondary piece of that too is, right, getting involved, right? It's going to take all of us getting involved and demanding that safety, right? If you are afraid, or if you're angry, whatever that emotion is, right, channeling that into advocacy. If you're angry, I was talking to somebody earlier today who was angry, you know, I was like, you know what, but channel that anger into advocacy, right? Change that into being a part of this fight so that generations from now don't have to continue to feel unsafe or have to feel afraid. So I would give that as kind of those two parts of people. If we're trying to give them confidence, we can give them confidence to know that this state is a leader. It's one of the lowest ones of gun deaths in the stretch of states across America. So we are leading in that space. It may not feel like that all the time because we still obviously experience gun crimes and gun deaths in this state, right? But we are pushing the needle. And if people join in this fight with us more and more, we can push that needle faster.
Thank you so much. Tremayne, could you share some of the data behind gun violence in our country, and you know, and where it's being impacted, and things that we need to be aware of? Like, is there, I don't know, this is so weird asking this, like, is there anything we should be like watching out for, or just be aware of?
Yeah, I could run through, and I can also share it with you after if you want to share it with the group, if that's an email later. The CDC, I'm part with Johns Hopkins, went through kind of 2020 data, as we also went through all things COVID-19, and they pulled some of the latest numbers around gun deaths. And so I can kind of quickly go through some of those two things that we have. But, you know, in 2020, was the latest big data that they pulled. You know, there were 45,222 gun deaths in the country. Gun deaths from 2019 to 2020, firearm homicides increased 35%. And one of the things that, you know, we have to share even more because it's very alarming, but never gets easy sharing, is now gun violence is the leading cause of death among children, teens, and young adults under the age of 25. Young people actually under the age of 30 were nearly 10 times more likely to die from firearm than they were from COVID. And, you know, I think it's also important to state again and mention, you know, as we talked about the different ways in which gun deaths are represented in our country, whether it be suicide, homicide, unintentional or accidental shootings, you know, or mass shootings, right? Many of them play a portion in those numbers, right? But again, more than the majority of those gun deaths are by suicide. Of that 45,000 odd deaths, over 24,000 of those were by way of suicide. But again, I can also go through these. I can share these out later. But it has risen, and it has impacted communities very differently. Communities of color obviously have felt this at a despairingly high level. Black males ages 15 to 34, I'm 30 going on 31, are 20 times more likely to be a victim of gun homicide So there are many numbers out there. I'll go through a couple more. On average day, more than 120 people are killed by guns in the United States. More people are killed now by guns than they die in car accidents. If we talk about how this also impacts us in many different ways as like a public health crisis, but also how it taps into economically. Gun violence costs the US about $280 billion each year. The average cost about $860 per person. There was actually a recent study that came out yesterday that I haven't delved into deeply that gives a higher number, but that accounts for, what the taxpayers pay on, or how that plays out to us, whether it's, when that person dies in an office, will that cost that business now to now hire a new person, counseling, mental health, all these different layers of what those numbers can mean, but how that economically ties out to impacting communities. And mass shootings, right, as we talk about it, really actually account for less than 1% of all gun deaths. So that's also what we talk about this as the public health crisis, because the majority of these deaths are by suicide gun deaths. But I'm happy to send that out after, because that was me kind of quickly going through some of the highlights. It's also a 40-page document, so it is a lengthy read, and I certainly don't want to go through all of those things in the short amount of time that we have.
That's really interesting. You said that the mass shooting episodes count for less than the other incidents, and I feel that's surprising, because the way that I understand when I watched the reporting on the news is that these are the reason why we have these problems, is these mass shooting incidents. And so what I'm learning from you is that gun violence is happening every day in these smaller episodes. And these bigger ones are the ones that are being reported on and exposed to us through the news.
And it does two things, right? It does, one, because of the intense media coverage of it, right? Again, we don't want to minimize these mass shootings. They are important to talk about because they also don't need to happen, right? But there's so many other deaths that happen every day that don't get highlighted because of that. And so sometimes it pushes those out of the way, which is why we also talk about, hey, we've got a public health crisis going on. We don't want to take away from these school shootings or things that are happening at hospitals. That is important to talk about. Our children don't need to be exposed to that. But we have people every day who are struggling and taking their own lives, and we're not paying attention to that fact that if we're just sticking to the state of Washington, 70%, that's a pretty large mass, right? If you equate that to like less than 1% of a mass shooting, right? So that's also that tricky thing too, that when we focus on one area, we put by the wayside so many others in our communities who are struggling with mental illness, because we've focused our intense media coverage on one thing in particular. And then two, it also sometimes does this harmful narrative when we talk about mass shooters, right? People often go to, right, where they're struggling with mental illness, right? And then that also creates a harmful stigma for people who are already struggling with mental illness, who might now not want to speak up because somebody might assume that they're going to be a mass shooter. When also with most mass shootings, there's already a connection there, especially when people go back to mass shootings in schools. They are usually going there connected to a particular person. And unfortunately, others become victims in that moment. So there's usually already a connection there when those mass shootings happen. But we need to also be talking about the stigma that then happens when we talk about, yes, it may be true for some of those people are struggling with mental illness. And right, we should have put resources there that we could have hopefully stopped them ahead of time too. But because of that media coverage, sometimes it takes away from all the other issues that we're seeing in our communities, by way of homicide or by way of suicide, that are greatly impacting our communities and our children. So that's a part of these conversations in public education is telling people, yes, we don't want to minimize. I always like to say that because I realize that sometimes we get into weird territory. I never want to make it seem like we are minimizing mass shootings, because those are most important to pay attention to as well. But we have a public health crisis. More of our people are losing their lives at the hands of themselves with their firearms.
Wow. That's just wow. I think this is the first time I've ever heard that it is through their own selves, they're shooting themselves, suicide. And that's so multi-layered and such a big issue. And then at the same time, it's really concerning. Um, how are these people are getting their hands on guns, especially since it's youth? And in the state of Washington, what is the youngest age, the minimum age of getting a gun?
We have some, these are parts of me coming into it new with our policy team. I know with their ballot initiative, with I think like semi-assault weapons and certain access points to certain weapons, it has been moved from 18 to 21, right? Which also highlights in the last couple of weeks, right, whether it was Buffalo and I think another one, right, where 18-year-olds were getting access to guns, I think causing mass shooting harm to others. We have bumped that up a couple of years ago to the age of 21 here. I do know off the top of my head, I can't remember what ballot initiative that is. I call that the before Tremayne days, but I know that years ago there was an initiative that addressed that. So I often say, again, right, when we're building that confidence of people here in the state to know that their state is doing that work, many of the things that passed in the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act are many of the things that we've already done here in the state of Washington. So we often joke that there's the tale of two Washingtons, that we are leading the other Washington on the other side, because many of the things they are looking to do, we've already done.
So how do we talk to gun lovers? These, the people who collect like a billion guns. They have like
Ah,
that huge gun storage. And how do we talk to people about how do we separate gun prevention, gun violence prevention from it is still okay for you to own a gun, but we want you to be smart about your ownership. And we want to make sure that not only you have the right to keep you and your family safe, but because you own that gun, you also are accountable for keeping the other people that are in your community safe.
yeah, you said it. That's the conversation. I would say outside of that, I joke, I'm a Southern boy. Send them to me. At this point, I'm a Southerner. I'm not afraid of anybody. I've also right, I've lived in spaces now where I've shared my stories, where I've lived in spaces where guns weren't safely stored and could have caused harm for myself or others. Right. That's often the thing too, that in that education with responsible gun owners, which arguably, right, I have friends who are firearm owners, happy to support them and love them dearly, right? But their guns are also like, most of them have children. They're locked in a firearm storage area in the basement in a whole nother room, locked away from their children, right? So they, in theory, hopefully there'll never be an issue if somebody broke into their house, right? It's going to be hard for that person to, through those layers, get to them, right? But when they're not safely stored at home, more people are at risk of when they have firearms, right, in the name of protecting themselves from outsiders. They're still at a greater risk of dying at the hand of that gun in their own household before somebody ever comes into it, right? Because again, if we pull up that 70% of people who might be struggling with suicide ideation or whatnot, right, they're already at a greater risk of harm at home before they ever have to worry about what is happening on the outside world, which is scary and fair, but still, statistically, there's more harm there. I would often say too, right, I've lived with firearm owners. Before I moved from Virginia, one of my last roommates was a firearm owner, but right, he had it locked away in this very beautiful safe in the basement. But, and even to me, he was like, if you want access to them or if you were to go to the range with me, totally down for it, but you got to go to a shooting range first so I can like teach you and then I'll give you the code. But like, he's doing all the things to be a responsible firearm owner. And most responsible firearm owners will be that same way, right? Again, it's going back to that beginning steps too, of taking all those trigger words out. Like, I'm not going to come to him and being like, John, let's talk about gun control. He would respectfully be like, love you so much, Tremayne, go to your room. We're not talking about this, right? I'm automatically going to get kicked out of the room with him because that's not the thing, right? Also, he's a responsible firearm owner. He's already going to believe in many of the things that I believe in because he's already doing them. He's shown to me that my firearms are safely secured and locked away. My friends' firearms are safely secured and locked away from their children, right? Their children have toy little BB guns, but even then, right, they've taught them the importance of like, you never aim at a person. We talk about why that's important, right? The education is already starting there. So I would say, in my opinion, and even here, working with the Alliance for Gun Responsibility, it holds a name. So sometimes people have preconceived notions of what I'm about to say in a room. And I've had people that are firearm owners approach me in public spaces out nowhere. Had a guy one time that was like, you're not gonna like me. And I was like, well, I'm a Southerner, buddy, so you can try. And by the end of that conversation, he walked away thanking me for speaking with him, right? Because I think that sometimes we have this scary conversation around responsible gun ownership, right? We immediately might think that it means I'm trying to take your guns away. Not at all. We're talking about that access point to getting to it, that it's been safely secured, that we've done all the steps in place to be responsible, right? And it's the same theory that I feel like we talk about a lot of things, whether it's a gun, whether it's a car or whatever, right? If you are an upstanding citizen, right? If you follow the rules already, you're never at jeopardy, right? You're not the issue. Or as I often tell people who are responsible gun owners, and they usually are like, yeah, my gun's already safely stored, and da da da. And I usually end the conversation with, great, well, join our team. Like, come be a volunteer. You are not my issue. Respectfully, I don't care. You're exactly who we need on the team. We need you exactly telling people that it's two things can be true. We can talk about gun violence prevention, and you can also still own your firearms. I mean, I was just in DC like last week, and the president himself, right? Where if you sometimes go into that political world and people think that if you're on this team, you're that, if you're on that team, you're that. The president himself said, look, I'm pro Second Amendment. I have shotguns, but they're locked away. They're safely secured, right? It's the simple common sense solutions that most Americans, the majority of Americans support. Most firearm responsible gun owners also support. It is just being careful really with how you navigate that conversation, right? Taking out all those sugar words. If you take that out immediately, right, you take away kind of the scary parts of that conversation. And now you're just coming in, hey, I just want to talk to you about safety. And I want to know if you believe in X, Y, and Z. And usually you will always find that the majority of people still believe in a universal background check just to make sure that those who have violent offenses do not have access to a firearm. Those agree to safe storage so that our children or anybody who breaks into our home right now doesn't get that firearm and takes it out there and creates harm for others, right? There are simple things that we believe in, right? That again balances rights and responsibilities. That still doesn't take anyone's Second Amendment right away. That's not our job. That's not what we do. That's not what I'll ever do. I live in the public education space, and hopefully through this conversation with her for an hour, you've never heard me mention one time here a thing that will actually take away anybody's Second Amendment right. That's not my job. My job is to educate people on the statistics and the facts of what are happening in their communities, and hopefully that they'll join us in sharing this education with others, whether you are a firearm owner or responsible firearm owner, or whether you're just a concerned citizen. We both can do this together and agree on the same things, and literally no responsible firearm owners ever lose their firearms. That's not our job. That's not our mission. That's not our goal. It's gun responsibility.
Thank you so much. I'm sure the gun owners that's on this in this conversation is really relieved.
I don't want your guns. I just want you to join the team of responsibility.
So before we open up the floor to any questions from our group, where can people find resources to advocate for gun prevention? Gun violence. I always want to say gun prevention. I'm so sorry, everybody. Gun violence prevention.
All good. Yeah, all those who want to be a part of gun violence prevention, if it's having those conversations, thank you so much, Kim. I was going to say, visit our website, gunresponsibility.org. There are many places and spaces up there that people can, as I like to say, choose to get in where you like to fit in. If you like to live in that C3 public education space, if there's a space that I can show up for you, again, whether it's a conference or a book club, I'm happy to be anywhere with all the people in all the places, because this is grassroots mobilization. This is community organizing, because it starts with conversations. Sometimes that can be very scary, but hopefully by the end of this, you have felt that like you can have this conversation with anybody, and it never has to get political, and it never has to get yucky and weird. It can be a conversation around safety, and that our children, our communities, our schools, our hospitals, our supermarkets, all the places in the last couple of months that have been tapped deserve safety and can have that safety if we all together as a community come together as one, checking our website to do that. And the work is possible. I mean, it took 30 years for this last bill to come through, but we can still show that there can be bipartisanship in what feels like a very partisan world that we live in now. The majority of people want it, even though sometimes it may not feel that way in the media. The majority of Americans support this work and want that safety. They want their children to be safe. So yeah, long story short, because I'm a long-winded English major, check out our website, and there's many different spaces up there that people can really just kind of get in where they fit in. Or if it's simply just following, getting on a newsletter and listening to what's happening. And then from there, you can kind of jump in whenever you would like to.
Well, thank you so much. So does anyone have any questions they would like to ask Tremayne? I know that I saw 2 comments in the chat. Is Brad, did you want to go a little bit more into that question about, you were saying, he was saying that yeah, there you go, Brad. Do you want to ask that question to Tremayne?
Well, that's, I appreciate, vote the guys out that are, you know, um, not helping with the gun violence end of it. But it's really hard to do that because it's a single issue vote then. Like, I find that I tend to want to vote for pro-life kinds of representatives. They tend to be Republicans that are also advocates for less gun control. And so it's really hard to make a single vote count in this area. So I appreciate what he's had to say, about getting involved and the comment from Lisa about how to weigh in on the various issues. But I don't know about voting as the only way to really impact the issue of gun violence. I don't know. It's a single issue which is hard to get around.
Yeah, and Brad, I would say additional thoughts there that first come to my mind, right, outside of voting, or right, it is hard to kind of single issue because many of these lawmakers are also under a platform that has many different issues, but you can always, outside of that, right, I encourage people to advocate for their elected officials then, and right, sharing this education and advocating, right, especially if you're voting for somebody who's pro-life, then in theory, right, I hope somebody that's pro-life then is also pro-gun violence prevention to save many lives as possible. And I think there's a space there where people, right, can advocate on that messaging as well, and right, organizing their own communities as well. Because I'm someone who grew up around that as well, and I have many friends who, right, are gun owners and Republican and pro-life, right, but they also promote, right, gun violence prevention on the same conversation of, right, pro-life, because children don't deserve to die at the hands of guns. And I think there's a space for that, to have that messaging with them and just advocating for those who have been in that place, right? And so doing that with yourself, right, getting more others involved in your communities as well, to talking to that elected official, because that advocacy can also help, right, change that needle to how they might also perceive it, right, and getting them, and maybe hopefully even getting them out of the thought of it being gun control, right? Because hopefully in the conversations that we've had today, again, still doesn't attack anybody's Second Amendment right. We just are talking about ways in which we can minimize gun violence. So I don't know if that's helpful. That's me off the top of my head. If you're right, that's another way to just kind of talk to that elected official and just keep advocating. Change is incremental, but the needle can move.
Does anyone else have a question for Tremayne?
Well, Tremayne, I thought that what you said about the trigger words and kind of better language was just, that was my big takeaway. Lots of notes, super, super helpful. And so just honing in on the gun violence prevention as a good common ground place for conversation. What are some other trigger words that you found that if you can avoid it, or maybe avoid it and then use different language to advance the conversation? What are some other things that you've learned? I know gun violence prevention is the big one.
Mm-hmm. I would say, and part of this would have to, we also have our wonderful comms team who has our messaging guidelines. I would say when I also was hired here, things that they were like, these are words that we don't use because that's not the space that we're living in. The biggest one was usually gun control, because that is the immediately thing. We are even careful in terms of how we say words like regulation, right? You'll always usually see me say life-saving legislation, or life-saving laws, because that is the intent, right? Everything that we do is with the intent of saving lives. We might say gun safety as well, or gun responsibility. We try to find those middle ground words that don't make it so politicized, because, right, gun responsibility is a word, or responsible firearm owners, right? But gun responsibility is kind of that middle ground word that everybody can agree to, whether you own them or you don't. Both sides, in theory, believe in gun responsibility and what that looks like. So those are definitely some of the words. It's gun violence prevention, gun responsibility, are words that we definitely use a lot. We don't use gun control. We are shy of using words like regulation because it just gets us into that. It turns us into, especially in my space, C3, very political. And I don't come here for politics. I come here for people and saving lives.
Thank you. Anyone else? We have time for one more before we end our time together. All right. Well, Tremayne, thank you so much for your time today. I feel like I learned so much about things I think I was fearful about before talking to you, and it's given me, I won't say a level of comfort, but it has informed me, and so I can make better decisions moving forward. So I really appreciate your time. Everyone, I did put Tremayne's organization, Alliance for Gun Responsibility, the website, in the chat. Please check that out. Tremayne, I'm sure if they wanted you to come into their church and do a talk, and yep, there it is. He said
I put it in there. Listen, I'm a Southern Baptist boy at my core. I will always be a little churchy boy. So I'm going to go to anybody's church and do it up.
Yeah, so you all can reach out to Tremayne. His email address is on the website. And so you all, I thank y'all for being a part. As said, it's 1 o'clock, you are hard stop. That's what we do. Thank you for being part of Pacific Northwest Lunch and Learns, which is our bite-sized social justice learning opportunity. I hope that you all learned something new. All right, take care, everybody. Bye-bye.
See y'all. Bye.